Dr. Albert Hayes had never been known for his subtlety. In fact, subtlety was almost a foreign language to him, one he never bothered to learn. At 43, he was far more interested in defying the laws of nature than adhering to them, far more comfortable in the confines of his laboratory than in the social rituals of polite conversation. As a theoretical physicist at the prestigious Graviton Institute, Albert's eccentricities were accepted as part of the genius that often accompanied breakthrough ideas, ideas that people either revered or mocked. His latest obsession? Harnessing the power of black holes, specifically the miniaturized versions that, until recently, had been more theoretical than practical. He had been working on a device that could contain and stabilize a tiny black hole, one so small it could only fit inside a laboratory's magnetic field. The plan was simple: if he could use this particle-sized black hole to generate energy, the possibilities were endless. Clean, sustainable energy. Infinite power. The world would never be the same. His colleagues, however, weren't nearly as optimistic. They called him crazy. Albert, his best friend and fellow scientist, Dr. Sophie Lane, said often, "You're going to kill us all one of these days." It wasn't that Sophie lacked faith in Albert's intelligence, she was simply pragmatic, and she knew that Albert's ambition often overshadowed his common sense. But that afternoon, as she stood outside the observation window of his lab, she couldn't deny the excitement in her chest as she watched Albert prepare for his next experiment. The mini black hole was already humming on the tabletop, inside a metallic containment sphere. The air in the lab was thick with anticipation. Albert adjusted his glasses, flipped a switch, and gave a satisfied hum of approval as the device roared to life. The mini black hole was stable, contained, no larger than a marble but with the gravitational force of a star. It floated above the table, suspended within a magnetic field, as if daring anyone to question its existence. "Okay, Sophie," Albert grinned, pulling a coffee cup from the desk. "Time to see if it works." Sophie couldn't help but smirk. "If this kills us, I'm blaming you." "But you already know that, don't you?" Albert laughed. "This isn't going to kill anyone. Just watch." He placed the cup near the event horizon of the black hole. The object hovered, then tilted and wobbled before, inexplicably, vanishing. Sophie blinked, certain she had seen it disappear into nothingness. She looked to Albert, who seemed entirely unfazed. "Don't worry," he said, adjusting the dials. "It's just bending space-time. I'll bring it back." Sophie didn't have time to respond before the lab was plunged into chaos. The containment field malfunctioned, the magnetic rings sparking in erratic flashes, and the room began to hum, a sound that felt as if the very air was bending around them. The black hole, still no larger than a marble, surged outward, a sudden, violent pull ripping through the lab. Objects, papers, tools, and even small bits of furniture began flying toward the singularity as if caught in an invisible vacuum. Before Sophie could react, Albert, standing too close to the containment field, was knocked off his feet. A burst of energy shot from the device, and the next thing Sophie knew, Albert was on the floor, motionless. Albert awoke in a haze of confusion. His head was pounding, his body felt unnaturally heavy, and he could hear a low, persistent hum, like the sound of a distant engine. He groaned, trying to push himself up. The room was a disaster, papers and equipment were strewn everywhere, the containment field sparking with unstable energy. He dragged himself to his feet, dizzy but determined. His vision wobbled, and for a moment, he thought the world itself was tilting sideways. He reached for the table to steady himself, but his hand passed through the edge like it was made of smoke. Albert blinked, staring at his fingers, his breath catching in his throat. What the hell? With growing unease, Albert took a step forward, but the air around him seemed to bend. It was as if the very fabric of space was stretching and warping with each movement. Objects around him, still floating from the black hole's pull, twisted in strange, disjointed patterns. A chair hung suspended in midair, spinning slowly, while a broken mug seemed to reform before his eyes. Albert's heart raced. He could feel something inside him, something pulsing. At first, it was faint, but then it grew stronger, an almost magnetic pull in the pit of his stomach, like gravity itself had focused within him. He stumbled toward the floating mug. Reaching out, he grasped it, then immediately felt a sharp tug as though the universe itself was bending around his hand. The mug was yanked from his grip, drawn toward him like a planet toward a sun. Albert staggered back, eyes wide. He saw the mug reform, its shattered pieces floating together before clicking back into place. It was as though reality itself had briefly unraveled, only to stitch itself back together in a moment of strange rebirth. It was the black hole. Somehow, it wasn't just in the machine anymore. It was inside him. The feeling intensified, and Albert suddenly felt as though his entire body was being stretched along an axis, like a piece of gum pulled from both ends. His stomach lurched as a powerful force, a gravitational one, threatened to pull him apart. The humming inside him became a roar, a constant, gnawing presence deep in his chest, as if he were a star about to collapse in on himself. He staggered toward the window, hands on the sill, looking out at the vast sky, his mind swirling with thoughts. There was no time to waste. This was no longer an experiment. This was real. He had become the thing he'd been playing with, the singularity, the black hole. Only, it was inside him. Sophie, meanwhile, had been busy calling for help. When she found Albert in the lab, she was horrified to see him standing there, wild-eyed, gripping the table like it was the only thing anchoring him to the world. "Albert," she cried. "What happened? Are you okay?" Albert turned to her, his eyes filled with both panic and awe. "Sophie," he gasped, his voice strained, "something's wrong. I think I'm the black hole now." Sophie froze, her face paling. She had always known Albert was a little obsessed with bending the laws of physics, but this was something else entirely. "Let's get you out of here," Sophie said, stepping forward, but Albert's hand shot up to stop her. No, you don't understand," he muttered, his breath shallow, the words barely comprehensible. "It's inside me. I can feel it, this force, this pull." He looked down at his hands, which were trembling as though they were at the edge of something monumental. "I can feel the gravity inside me, Sophie. It's like I'm part of the fabric of space itself." Sophie's mind raced. She could see it now, the faint, shimmering aura around Albert, as if the very air was warping around him. Something was wrong, terribly wrong. If the black hole had really merged with his body, she didn't even want to think about the consequences. "Okay," Sophie said quickly, trying to keep her calm. "We need to get you to the medical lab. We need to stabilize this, now." Albert shook his head, his expression manic. "It's too late. It's already too strong. I can feel it pulling, everything." His voice trailed off as if he were hearing something beyond her, beyond the room. The humming had turned into something else now, a rumbling, deep and primal, coming from within his very chest. Sophie could hear it, too, and it terrified her more than any experiment gone wrong ever had. She didn't know what to do. How do you stop a black hole from pulling you in? How do you fix something like that? Albert's mind was racing. The black hole inside him wasn't just warping space, it was warping his very perception of time. Memories that had once been clear now seemed distant, blurry. It was as though his life was suddenly on fast forward, as if time itself was collapsing in on him, stretching into the infinite void of the singularity that had taken root inside him. He turned to Sophie. I think I can do it. I think I can bring things back. I can rebuild things." Sophie narrowed her eyes. "What do you mean?" He didn't answer her immediately. Instead, he extended his hand toward the nearby broken equipment, wires, bolts, a circuit board, and to her amazement, they seemed to shift and float in midair, rearranging themselves, as if guided by an unseen hand. "Look," Albert whispered, "I can remake things. I can resurrect them." But the moment the words left his lips, the lab's walls groaned. space itself seemed to warp, and Albert's stomach churned. The black hole inside him was hungry. Always hungry. Albert's outstretched hand trembled as the broken pieces of equipment floated lazily in the air before him, spinning slowly, as if caught in the gravitational field of a distant planet. His heart raced, his breath shallow. He could feel the black hole stirring inside him again, a growing presence that seemed to consume every part of his body, his mind. It was both exhilarating and terrifying. He could sense the pull of the event horizon, its insatiable hunger. But at the same time, there was something else, a rush of power, of control. The wires floated together, and the circuit board snapped into place as though guided by an invisible force. A faint hum filled the room, the strange energy of creation and destruction mixing together. Albert's eyes widened in wonder, as though he were a child seeing magic for the first time. "Sophie," he said, his voice thin but intense. "I can bring things back. I can rebuild them. Don't you see? I can fix this. I can fix everything." Sophie looked at the floating objects, her mind struggling to comprehend what she was witnessing. She had known Albert for years, had seen him push the boundaries of science in ways that most people could never understand. But this? This wasn't science anymore. This was something beyond anything she could grasp. "Albert," she said slowly, her voice filled with caution, this isn't just about fixing things, is it? You're changing the very nature of reality here. The black hole inside you, do you even understand what it's doing to you?" Albert didn't respond immediately. He was lost in the sensation, in the thrill of his newfound abilities. His fingers twitched, and the floating objects began to rearrange themselves more quickly, assembling into a crude, incomplete form of a machine. His vision blurred for a moment, and when it cleared, he was no longer in the lab. At least, not entirely. Time had begun to fragment around him. He could see the room, but also something else, a faint, shifting image of the past, when the lab had been untouched, pristine, before the black hole accident. For a moment, Albert was unsure if he was still in the present, or if he had somehow slipped into another dimension entirely. The room wavered, distorted, and for a heartbeat, everything felt both infinitely far away and impossibly close. He reached out, feeling the fabric of time itself stretch between his fingers. It was the black hole's doing, he realized. It wasn't just manipulating space, it was bending time. It wasn't just in him. It was him. His heart hammered in his chest as the realization hit him. Sophie was right. He wasn't just tinkering with physics anymore. He was playing with the very foundation of reality. "Albert?" Sophie's voice cut through the haze. "What's happening to you?" He looked at her, his eyes wide, full of something between panic and exhilaration. He opened his mouth to respond, but before he could speak, the world around them seemed to twist violently, as if the fabric of space itself had been torn. A loud cracking noise filled the room, and then, with a sudden jolt, everything snapped back into place. Albert stumbled, his head spinning. For a moment, he could see everything at once, past, present, future, each layer of reality floating like translucent sheets of paper stacked on top of one another. His mind raced, trying to make sense of it, but the more he thought, the more the pieces of reality seemed to slip away. "No. No, no." Albert muttered, his voice shaking. "I'm losing it. It's too much. It's all falling apart." Sophie reached out, her hand steady as she touched his arm. "Albert, you have to focus. The black hole inside you, if you lose control, everything will collapse. You can't keep pushing it." "I don't know how," Albert said, his voice breaking. "I don't know how to stop it." His breathing became rapid, shallow. The world around him seemed to pulsate with a strange energy, the air thick with the weight of the singularity inside him. He could feel it growing, pulling, distorting reality further. The floor beneath his feet felt like it was shifting, and he staggered, trying to keep his balance. His skin felt hot, like a furnace, and his thoughts were becoming harder to hold on to. He reached for the nearest object, a metal wrench, and when he grasped it, it began to pull from his hand, as if the wrench itself were being drawn into the singularity. "Albert!" Sophie cried, her voice cutting through the madness. "Stop!" But Albert wasn't listening. He couldn't. He was too far gone, lost in the chaos of his own creation. He felt the gravitational pull growing stronger, a constant force tugging at his body, at his mind. His thoughts were scattering, becoming fragmented, twisted. The black hole inside him wasn't just a part of him, it was controlling him. Desperately, Albert slammed his hands against his head, trying to hold on to whatever fragment of himself remained. But the black hole's pull was insistent, overwhelming. His vision blurred again, the edges of reality warping and twisting as the singularity inside him seemed to consume everything, his memories, his sense of self, his very existence. "Stop. Please." Sophie's voice again, sharp with panic. "Albert, focus. You can't let it take you. You have to find a way to control it." But Albert couldn't hear her anymore. All he could hear was the deafening hum, the roar of the black hole, a sound like 1,000 voices crying out in unison. He could feel the pull intensifying, drawing everything around him in. The walls were beginning to bend, the air distorting like heat waves over a fire. And then, with a sickening lurch in his stomach, the lab itself seemed to fold in on itself, as though it were being drawn into the singularity center. Albert felt a sharp pain in his chest. His breath hitched. The gravitational force inside him was unbearable. It was as if his very atoms were being pulled apart, stretched, torn. But then, in that moment of intense pressure, something inside him snapped. It was the only word in his mind. A desperate plea. He didn't know if he could do it, but he had to. He couldn't let the black hole consume him. Not now. Not after everything. Albert closed his eyes, taking a deep, steadying breath. He focused all his energy, all his will, on the singularity inside him. He imagined a force, a counterforce, something to push back against the pull, something that could contain it. Slowly, carefully, he began to channel all the energy, all the power, into one singular thought. For a moment, it felt like the entire universe had stopped moving. The room stilled, the hum faded, and Albert felt a strange calm wash over him. The black hole within him, still there, still powerful, seemed to stabilize. It didn't go away. But it paused, just long enough for Albert to gather himself. He opened his eyes. The world was no longer warping, no longer tearing apart. The air felt still, heavy, but manageable. He could still feel the black hole, its presence lingering inside him, but it wasn't pulling him apart anymore. It was just there. Sophie, who had been watching him with wide, fearful eyes, exhaled in relief. "Albert, you did it. You stopped it." Albert didn't respond right away. He was still too shaken, still too overwhelmed by the experience. The gravitational pull was there, yes, but it wasn't tearing him apart. Not yet. His body, his mind, was still intact. But for how long? And what would happen next? He couldn't answer her. He didn't know. The lab was in ruins, the walls cracked, and the air was thick with the energy of the event. But Albert had, for the moment, regained control. It wasn't perfect. It wasn't fixed. But it was a start, and it was all he had. "I don't know if I can do this again," Albert whispered, his voice hoarse, "but I have to. I have to find a way to stop it. To fix it." Sophie stepped closer, her expression a mix of concern and cautious optimism. "And you will, Albert. You always do." But Albert wasn't so sure anymore. As he stood there, staring at the wreckage of his life, he knew one thing for certain: whatever he had unleashed inside himself, whatever power he had tapped into, was more dangerous than he could ever have imagined, and it wasn't done yet. Albert stood there, his body still humming with the remnants of the black hole's energy, the weight of the experience sinking in. His mind raced, but his thoughts were heavy, tangled in the chaos of what he had just lived through. He had only barely contained the singularity within himself. He didn't know how he had done it, or if he could do it again, but he understood one thing with chilling clarity: the black hole inside him was far more than just a scientific curiosity now. It was a force. A force that had become a part of him, woven into the very fabric of his being. And he wasn't sure how much longer he could control it. Sophie's gaze was fixed on him, her eyes wide with something between disbelief and awe. She wasn't asking questions anymore. She wasn't even sure she could. "Albert," she said after a long silence, her voice quieter now, as if she were trying not to disturb the delicate balance between them. "What happens next?" He turned to face her. His mouth opened, but nothing came out at first. His throat felt dry, his chest tight. He had no answer. How could he explain it to her? He wasn't sure he even understood it himself. "I don't know," he finally said, his voice low and strained. "I don't know if I can keep it under control. Every time I try to manage it, it gets worse." Sophie nodded, stepping closer, her expression softening. "But you're still here. You're still, you." Albert's gaze fell to his hands. He could feel the black hole, a gravitational pull that seemed to emanate from his very skin. He wondered if Sophie could see it, too, if the air around him was still bending, shifting, distorting. Maybe she couldn't see it, but he could feel it. The black hole inside him was a living thing, breathing and pulsing, an entity that existed outside the normal rules of nature. It wasn't just a force of destruction. It was a part of him, and for better or worse, it would always be. "You don't understand," Albert murmured, almost to himself. "I'm not just carrying it. I'm becoming it." Sophie stepped back, her eyes narrowing. "What do you mean?" He shook his head, not ready to say the words aloud. He wasn't sure he even wanted to. If he said it, it would make it real. But deep inside him, he could feel the truth: the black hole wasn't just inside him. It was rewriting his very nature, changing him in ways he couldn't predict, couldn't even comprehend. "I think I can do more than just control it, Sophie," Albert continued, his voice steadying. "I think I can reshape reality. I can bend time and space. I can bring things back." Sophie blinked. "Bring things back?" "Objects. People. I can resurrect them." Albert's voice shook at the last word, and he looked away from her, unable to meet her gaze. "But every time I do, it takes more. It takes more than I can give." For a moment, Sophie didn't speak. Her face was unreadable, her eyes searching his face as though looking for something. She had always known Albert had a certain obsession with the boundaries of physics, but this was something else entirely. She had never seen him so vulnerable, so broken. And yet, she could still see the scientist in him, the relentless curiosity that had driven him to the edge of his limits. "You think you can control it?" Sophie asked softly. "Even if it means tearing apart reality?" Albert didn't answer right away. He was lost in his thoughts, staring at the twisted remains of the lab, at the distorted space around them. He could feel the pull of the black hole growing stronger, but it wasn't the physical gravity that worried him anymore. It was the other force, the one deep within his mind, the one that kept telling him that he could fix everything. He could rewrite the past, change the future. If only he could learn to control it. If only he could master the power coursing through him. "I don't know how much longer I can keep it together," he admitted, the words feeling like a confession. "Every time I bring something back, it's like the black hole inside me gets hungrier. I can feel it taking pieces of me, my memories, my sanity. It's swallowing me whole." Sophie reached out, her hand gently touching his arm, grounding him. "You don't have to do this, Albert. You don't have to keep pushing yourself. You can stop before it's too late." But Albert didn't want to stop. Not yet. Not when he was so close to unlocking the secrets of life and death, to bending the universe to his will. He had always been obsessed with the idea of controlling nature's most powerful forces, but now that he had the power to do it, he felt something else entirely, something primal, something dangerous. "I can't stop," Albert said, his voice harsh. "Not now. Not after everything I've seen. If I can't control this, if I can't learn to wield it, then everything I've done up until now will have been for nothing. I'll be lost to it. I have to understand it, Sophie. I have to learn how to use it." Sophie could see the determination in his eyes, the same fierce light that had always driven him. She had seen him dive into his research with the same reckless abandon, the same obsession. But this? This was something else. This wasn't just about science anymore. This was about survival. And she didn't know if Albert could survive it, but she couldn't stop him. She knew that much. Albert wasn't the kind of person who could be stopped by a simple word of caution. He had to learn this on his own. Even if it killed him, suddenly, the air around them seemed to grow colder, heavier. Albert looked up, his eyes widening in sudden realization. The black hole inside him had shifted, its gravitational pull intensifying once again. He could feel it, the hunger, the insatiable need to consume. And this time, it wasn't just objects around him that were being pulled in. It was something else. Sophie turned quickly. "Albert? What's happening?" He didn't respond. He was too focused on the surge of energy inside him, the pull of the singularity growing stronger by the second. He could feel it stretching outward, reaching for everything in its vicinity. The air crackled, the room seemed to distort, and then, it happened. The walls of the lab began to buckle inward. The floor trembled as if the very structure of the building were being torn apart. Albert's vision blurred again, his mind splitting between multiple realities. He saw the past and the future, caught in a tangled web of possibility. In the midst of the chaos, he caught a glimpse of something that made his blood run cold. Sophie, her form dissolving, being pulled toward him like the rest of the room. The black hole was expanding, and this time, it wasn't just pulling in objects. It was pulling in people. "No!" Albert shouted, his voice hoarse with desperation. He reached out for Sophie, his hands grasping at the air as the pull of the singularity intensified. "Sophie, get back. You have to get away." But it was too late. The gravitational force was too strong. Sophie was being sucked toward him, her feet lifting off the ground. The room around them was collapsing, the walls closing in like the jaws of a monster. "Albert, stop it!" Sophie screamed, her voice choked with fear. But even as she spoke, she could see the horror in his eyes. He couldn't stop it. He couldn't control it. Albert felt the singularity inside him rip at his very soul. He could feel it pulling at his body, his mind, every part of him. The hunger was overwhelming, but he couldn't let it take her. Not Sophie. With every ounce of willpower he could summon, Albert reached deep inside himself, pulling against the black hole's pull. He imagined the force within him as a knot, something he could control, something he could unravel before it consumed them both. For a brief moment, there was a flicker, like a spark of light in the darkness. He reached out for Sophie, and she seemed to freeze mid-air, suspended in time. "Not yet," he whispered, the words barely escaping his lips. Then, with one final, desperate push, Albert did the only thing he could think of: he let go. The room exploded with energy, a violent surge of power that sent everything, flying outward in a chaotic burst of light and sound.